Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. We're going to go in a different direction, but we're going to be continuing our discussion related to symbology, looking at signs and symbols. What we're going to be doing right now is we're going to be looking at this dynamic known as the apocalypse. And for those who are not familiar with this idea of the apocalypse, apocalypse is basically about revealing something that is hidden, that's not obvious. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be doing a little psychohistorical analysis. I am not a biblical scholar, and so this is going to be coming from perhaps a different vantage point than people are used to looking at this. And we're going to look to see if we see any credence for the argument that things that are presented, these signs and symbols that are presented in this vision in Revelation, the book of Revelation. We're going to be looking at 17 and 18 specifically because there is a lot of finger pointing related to Revelation 17 and 18. And we're going to see if there is any credence to some of this finger pointing about who these symbols are representing or what these symbols are representing and whether they have any relevance for current spaces, current people, current times. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be breaking down a few terms. We're going to start off in little small chunks and we're going to do it in different parts so that it doesn't become overwhelming and people can kind of stick with the theme and get a better understanding of perhaps what is being presented in this vision. And again, this is a vision coming from a person, so they are basically articulating what it is that they saw. And so we're going to try to look at that and see if we can see some of what they saw. And that takes looking at this dynamic from both a historical standpoint, but also a psychological standpoint as we look at some of these signs and symbols. So let's get started. Let's just quickly look at what we're going to be going over. We're going to be looking at this dream vision content. So we're going to be looking at manifest symbols, and it's really important that you look at things from a manifest standpoint first, what is being presented, and then get into the symbolic nature of that. So we're going to be looking at the dynamic of language also, and this language is coming out of the Greek for this particular book. And you also have a number of metaphors. So we're going to check out some of these metaphors related to harlotry and adultery, and also this dynamic of gendered geography. Let's get started with the backdrop for this situation, this vision, this dream. In this vision and dream, there is a rider, and this rider, it's a woman, and the woman is on this beast. And so there are a couple of things to think about just in terms of that image alone. And so some of the things to think about in terms of something riding and something being ridden is one, when you have a rider, the rider is actually guiding, directing, and controlling that which is ridden. And so this quote unquote woman who is on this beast is basically, in terms of this symbolism here, is guiding, directing, and controlling the beast that is being ridden. Another thing to think about in terms of just practical analysis here, in terms of this beast being ridden, is that a beast or whatever is ridden provides transportation, provides access, and also provides a sense of security for the rider. And so you can think about yourself if you are riding in a car, you're driving a car. If you were actually on a horse, this would be the dynamic that would be going on. That which is written, which would also be this beast, this animal, serves as the vehicle or the conduit. This is the conduit for the rider. This is the vehicle through which the rider operates. And so you think about your operator's license. You are operating the vehicle. And so the same thing can be said for this image, this dynamic that's going on in this vision. So the other thing is that which is ridden, that beast or that animal, is under the authority of the rider. That's why when you are driving, you are responsible for what happens in the car when you are driving it, because it is under your authority, under your control. And another thing to consider when thinking about this image is that the rider is the greater power of the two. And so you have this vehicle, but the vehicle doesn't operate by itself when it is being driven, when it's being ridden. It is under the control of the rider. And so therefore the rider is the actual greater power. And so in this image, you actually see there's a focus on that which is ridden, to the exclusion of a focus on that which is behind that which is ridden. And so there's a focus on the facade, that which is presented first, that which looks almost larger than life. And then you have the power behind it actually almost being ignored. So let's look at this concept that is the overarching concept. And it is in this vision, in this dream, this idea of harlotry. And so you hear the individual who's riding on the beast referred to as the great harlot or the great prostitute. So we're going to deconstruct this idea of the prostitute. So this sort of schema of prostitute and what it might mean in the context of this vision and in the context of this dream. What was the person seeing, or what are they trying to communicate about what they saw? So we're going to quickly look at an overarching idea of harlotry or prostitution before we get into the specifics. Sometimes you may hear this word used to refer to sort of the selling of the body, but it can also relate to the selling of the soul or the selling of the spirit. It's this idea of selling out, selling the self out in some way, form, or fashion. And so it's that idea of being basically a sellout. So let's jump into this scripture. Now there are variations in terms of the versions that people prefer. And so we're going to look at the NIV, which is the New International Version. Then we're going to quickly look at the King James Version. And you will see essentially that the constructs are pretty consistent. So even if you look at the Geneva, you will see this consistency. There is this focus of this person riding on this animal, this beast, and the person is described in terms of being a harlot, not just a harlot, but the great harlot. And so it's not even a great harlot, but the great harlot. So the ultimate would be what would be considered here. And so there's also this focus in terms of wording on the idea of adultery and fornication. And so you have things that have very practical meanings, and then you have these metaphorical dynamics going on here. But we're going to look at both. And just so you can see, here's the King James Version, and you can see that the wording is different, but you basically have the same dynamic in terms of the meanings of these words or these concepts, these symbols. And so another thing that we're going to take notice of is this naming dynamic. And so there are instances where you have gendered references and they are referring to what might be considered a person. But then you have gendered references that appear to be talking about geopolitical spaces or at least geographic spaces. There is a theme around this idea of the female or the feminine. But when we dig deeper, we see that some of the dynamics that are going on relate to some masculine dynamics or dynamics related to males versus females. And these are just a couple of examples of groups going by feminine names in scripture. And so one you see with this idea of Israel. Israel is repeatedly referred to as she and her. This is very interesting because there is a patriarchal focus. When you hear people talk about Israel, there's often a patriarchal focus. But in the context of the scripture, there is a focus on Israel as an entity, as a people, taking on a gendered identity, and that gendered identity being related to that which is female or that which is feminine. And so that is one instance in scripture that you see this gender dynamic going on. It's related to this particular group of people. Now, because of the placement of this discussion in the scripture, Revelation being in what's called the New Testament, this would be relevant to that. And so here you see another gendered dynamic related to religion in this case, and you see it related to the Catholic Church. And here is an article talking about how did the Catholic Church get her name. And so there's a reference to the church also being understood as the feminine. And here are some additional female associations related to geography. You have Terra, which relates to Terra. We'll look at that. You also have Africa, you have Europa, and you also have Germany. This is when things shift gears. And so we are looking at Strong's Concordance, and we're looking at this idea of adultery. And so initially you have this focus on this quote unquote harlot who's riding the beast. So there are all of these female associations. But what is going on is in this discussion, it's discussing adultery, this idea of fornication. And so you have the standard understanding of fornication or adultery, but then you also have the symbolic or metaphorical understanding of it. And what's interesting about this, because we're looking at Strong's Concordance and how this concept is understood, and so there is a heavy focus on this dynamic being a masculine dynamic. And so you have adultery usually of a man. And then there are discussions about this dynamic with a man and several scriptures that point to it. And then you also have of women. And then you have the figurative, which is that idolatrous relationship, that idolatrous worship. And all of this can be going together. And so we're going to look a little bit more deeply at this idea of adultery that is brought up in this particular scripture with respect to this woman riding this beast. And I want to point out something before we go any further about adultery, because there are all sorts of assertions, again, about who that woman is on that beast. And so one of the things to keep in mind about adultery, and so if you're looking at a certain situation today, for instance, and you're trying to figure out what geopolitical space is this vision all about, one of the things to take into consideration is that adultery indicates that there's a prior relationship, there's a prior commitment, there is a prior allegiance, and then there's this breach of the marital contract, which also ties into that metaphor, that metaphorical dynamic of idolatry. However, whatever is going on, you have this prior dynamic going on in the narrative about adultery. And so adultery is not just about some random person, or if you were talking about geography, it wouldn't be about some random geography committing adultery. There would have to have been a faithfulness or a relationship that was supposed to be predicated upon allegiance and faith and things like that. And so some people, point to all sorts of geographic spaces with respect to this. But if you're going to look at this in terms of what it's talking about, then the geographic relationship or the people would have to have a relationship with respect to this particular book and this particular deity. And here you can see how the idea of idolatry with respect to fornication and adultery, you can see how it can have multiple meanings. And so initially, many people would think of idolatry and they would think of the worship of idols, something physical, something tangible. But it can also be related to idolizing someone or something. So this extreme reverence for an entity. So it doesn't have to just be an object, but you will hear the phrase object of affection. And so it's worshiping something as if it is a god, putting it up on that type of pedestal. So having this devotion to something, again, worshiping something. And this can happen with respect to a thing. It can also happen with respect to a person. It can happen with respect to an idea. And so this idea of idolatry can mean a few things, even in the context of this scripture. Now, when you go into the Greek, you get a little bit more specification here, and you can see that this idea of idolatry is about image worship, specifically worshiping images and having worship service related to this. And so it's tied up in the idea of a false god, and so an idol, an image. And interestingly, there is a lot of discussion or focus on idolatry with respect to that beast that's being ridden, and also the relationship between the woman who's riding the beast and others, those who are in higher places, not just your average human being. Now, this is where things begin to turn. This idea of fornication that is discussed in Revelation 17 relates to this construct of Kadesh or Kadesh. And this is related to temple prostitution, very specifically. This is cult prostitution or cult prostitutes. Also heavily related to male cult prostitutes, individuals who are known as sodomites, those who are known as temple prostitutes, those who are known as sort of sacred prostitutes, so basically religious prostitutes. And so you can see over to the right-hand side some examples of how this is used in other scriptures, so other books. And you can see that there is a deep focus on this prostitution being a cult-like prostitution. And there is the idea of sodomite that is a big part of this male cult prostitution. And so this is a very specific dynamic that is being discussed here. And so the primary form of prostitution, interestingly, is not about the female. It's about male cult prostitution. And so that's something important to keep in mind. So you've got all of these gender dynamics going on. You've got a female riding a beast, then you have fornication, and you have prostitution, and then you have this focus in terms of how prostitution is understood in this context of it being temple prostitution, cult prostitution, and male cult prostitution. And so that's a very specific thing to take into consideration when deconstructing this, according to this vision that was seen. And here you see supporting this idea of cult prostitution or temple prostitution, this idea of being set apart or consecrated for that specific purpose. And then Strong's 6942 takes us to this idea of sodomite or being unclean. But the person is also understood as a sacred person. And it relates to this idea of a male devotee who is involved in this prostitution, but also relates to this prostitution taking on an idolatrous form. And here you see an etymology walk back through, and you go into 6948, and you see the other variation of this. And you see that again, it means harlot or whore. And then you have the female version of it. And then there is a discussion on the other side, on the right-hand side there, about a female devotee, also related to this dynamic. But what's interesting and important to keep in mind with all of this focus on the quote-unquote harlot being a female, you have the main understanding of both the fornication and the this harlotry being related to cult prostitution and male cult prostitution. And so it's very important to keep this in mind, because when you're looking at the history of the place that John was in, this may make more sense. But just on the surface, it may seem really sort of out of order. Now we're going to look at the King James Bible Dictionary specifically, and it talks a little bit more in detail about this idea of fornication in the Greek and the transliteration of pornos. And so it basically, in terms of Bible usage, it is saying that it is talking about someone who is a fornicator and a whoremonger. And so what else is also interesting is that when you look down at the Thayer's definition, again, there is this pivoting from this female focus in terms of prostitution, in terms of this harlotry, and the focus is on male prostitution. And so it says a man who prostitutes his body, a male prostitute, a man who indulges in unlawful sexual intercourse, a fornicator. And again, this is also relating to idolatry. But in this instance, you can see where there is quite a bit of shifting here in terms of what these constructs even mean. And here we have additional discussion coming out of Encyclopedia Britannica related to Kadesha. And you see again that this is a class of sacred prostitutes that were found throughout the ancient Middle East. And so you will see that there's evidence of this fertility goddess worship and sacred prostitution going on in a number of places. Now, some people are asserting that all of this is about the West, meaning America, and suggesting that the ancient Middle East is actually America and there has been some switching around. However, there's no consistent evidence to support that idea, so we're going to stick with what we are seeing and what is the standard narrative for now. If something else comes out, we will address that. And so basically in this area, there was a lot of temple worship with these sacred prostitutes, and they could be either male or female. And so that's important to also keep in mind, because often there is an assertion that when you're talking about prostitution, particularly when you're talking in religious terms, there will tend to be an automatic focus on prostitution that might relate to that which would be considered female, to the exclusion of the historical dynamic of there being individuals who were male prostitutes. And so there's a little discussion here about the other cultures that were involved in this temple prostitution or this sacred prostitution related to fertility goddess worship often. Now, in terms of history, another thing that is important to keep in mind is, where was this dynamic normalized? And what you see is that this was a common feature of ancient Greek and Roman societies. And so having male brothels, this was a normal part of their culture. This was a part of their cultural and political reality. And so it's important to keep that in mind in terms of trying to understand who this woman is on this beast, what the beast is, if the beast is actually symbolizing something, what it's symbolizing, what is this fornication all about, who were the fornicators. And so it's important to keep all of this in mind when trying to understand what John is saying he was seeing. This is additional discussion from Cambridge talking about male sex work in ancient Greek culture. And so it's important to remember that there were different classes of this culture of prostitution in Greek culture. And so there were a number of dynamics going on. There was also female prostitution, but there was a heavy focus on male prostitution in both Greek and Roman culture. And not only was there a focus on that, that wasn't the only type of prostitution. There was also using people who were underage in these dynamics. And so there were a number of things going on in Greek and Roman culture that need to be considered when trying to understand what it is that John, again, is trying to communicate related to these visions and dreams. So let's recap what we've looked at. We've looked at some ideas related to this prostitution, harlotry, adultery, fornication that is presented in this dream, in this vision. And we've gotten a better understanding of what these things might have meant during that time in terms of the person who's doing the dreaming, the person who is having the vision. When they are communicating, we're getting a better idea based upon their history and this time frame, a better idea of what they are talking about when they talk about prostitution, harlotry, adultery, and they are using these symbols, these metaphors, to provide a better understanding of what it is that they are seeing. And so one of the things to keep in mind related to that idea of the prostitute is that which is prostituting itself, that which is the great prostitute, the great harlot, is riding on something else, and it is controlling something else. According to this vision, it is controlling something else, that beast. It is also using the beast in order to get access, in order to transport itself, in order to provide security for it. It's also basically in control of the beast. It has the authority over this beast. And so this woman that is presented, this great harlot that is presented, and the harlot that is presented is the greater power of the two. What's also important to remember is that in this vision, there's a discussion of prostitution, but in the context of this reading, the prostitution that was common and commonly discussed in this context was related to male cult prostitution and idolatry related to that. And so it's important to tie all of those things together and not just see this as a presentation of a woman on a beast and all of this being about the standard presentation of the prostitute harlot scheme. It's also important, if people are trying to then relate this to current times, to think about that gendered geography dynamic where certain places actually are named according to the feminine. They have a feminine connotation, and not all places on the earth right now have a feminine connotation, even though there is this feminine connotation to the earth itself. And so there are certain spaces that identify as the feminine. So they identify basically as Gaia in different ways. And so it's important to keep that in mind also, because again, there is often a focus or an attribution in current times, suggesting that certain places are being mentioned, are being discussed in these visions. But if you're looking at current times, some of those places don't actually fit when you look at the descriptions in either 17 or 18. And this is just based upon a close reading. This is not based upon me being a biblical scholar. And so this again is just looking at the signs and symbols and doing a little symbolic walk through what is being discussed. As we continue on into part 2 and subsequent parts, we're going to be picking up next, hopefully, and we're going to be looking at the name, this mysterious name people refer to as Mystery Babylon. We're going to quickly deconstruct that to get a better idea of what that name is all about. Many people, both in America and outside of America, will frequently refer to America as this Babylon, this Mystery Babylon. But that may not be based upon the vision and the dream and what is presented in that vision and that dream. And so there are a number of things that are presented that don't necessarily point the way to America. And so we're going to look at that and perhaps try to get a better understanding of what John thinks he is pointing to. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.